Oh my goodness.
Here we go. Let's do this.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for waiting. We've had some technical difficulties. As you all know, computers and technology can be a challenge sometime, but we're very happy to say that we have solved it, and Donzaleigh and Tiffany have worked it all out, and Shauna, and we're on our way, and you're in for a very wonderful, informative afternoon. Donzaleigh is coming to us today from Toronto, Canada. She's up in Toronto filming with CBS the Good Sam series starring Sophia Bush. So we are delighted that she's able to be with us today. Also, very pleased that Pasadena Public Library is honored to celebrate the achievements and contributions of Black Americans and their central role in our nation's history, with many virtual programs, story hours, and activities for everyone of all ages and for our community. We have a wonderful brochure that is available at all of our branches that lists all of the programs. Everything's listed here. Please go to one of our branches and pick it up. You can also download it from our homepage, Pasadena Public Library's homepage, and you can see all of our programs in our off the shelf. So today, as you know, we're welcoming Donzaleigh Abernathy. But before we get going, I want to talk a little bit about optimal viewing, though you probably all know that. Just mute yourself. There's live transcript. We have chat. Donzaleigh will answer all your questions at the end of the program, and she has also allowed us to record it for YouTube Pasadena Library. So if you've come to one of our programs presenting Donzaleigh Abernathy, I'm sorry, sometimes I mispronounce it. She has presented for the Pasadena Public Library for the past 4 years. Ralph David Abernathy and Martin Luther King were inseparable and together helped to establish what would become the modern American civil rights movement. Miss Abernathy is Ralph's youngest daughter. She has written Partners to History, and this is the book, Partners to History. We have 2 copies in the Pasadena Public Library that you can check out. It is a fabulous book. The photos in here and the information is absolutely wonderful. So I encourage you to check it out from the Pasadena Public Library. She's written Partners to History as a testament to the courage, strength, and endurance of these men who stirred a nation with their moral fortitude. She also pays tribute to the thousands of unsung heroes, the other partners to this history, who were foot soldiers in the endless struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. And so we are delighted that she's here today to be talking about her book, Partners to History, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph David Abernathy, and the Civil Rights Movement. So welcome, Donzaleigh. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to apologize for the technological problem. I am of another generation where we wrote everything, and so, or we typed on a typewriter, and so computers are challenging for me. So I have to blame myself, I think. But thank you so much, Tiffany, for helping. Anyway, this is Black History Month, and it's important, I think, now today more than ever, as across America, people are trying to take away our right to vote. So I want to share just the history, and I pray this advances correctly. So I hope you can see that this is my dad and Martin Luther King. They were best friends. And so they met many, oh my God, long before the civil rights movement started. how Daddy and Uncle Martin met was that my dad had completed his undergraduate education at Alabama State University, and he was at Atlanta University getting his master's degree in sociology. And Martin Luther King was at Morehouse College getting his undergraduate degree. Well, my dad at that point had already decided that he wanted to become a minister. He preached his first sermon officially on Mother's Day while he was there at Alabama State, because his mother had died the year prior to that. And he believed that the loss of his mother was God trying him and asking him to step forward for what he always believed was his purpose in life, which was to be a minister. So while he's there in Atlanta, at Atlanta University, he's taking classes at ITC into theological seminary. And he's, trying to study to be a minister as well. A Reverend King Sr., who was Martin Luther King's father, we called him Granddaddy. He invited a group of ministers to come and hear Uncle Martin speak. And my dad was among those group of ministers. He said, will you please come listen to my son? And so my dad, wanting to hear all young ministers, because of course they want to see if someone else is doing something they're not doing, or, just to support each other as well. My dad went, and this was Uncle Martin's first sermon ever, and he was delivering it at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And at the close of the sermon, Uncle Martin went and stood at the back of the door of the church, the way people enter the church. And my dad walked up to him and commended him on the sermon that he delivered, told him how wonderful he was, and they shook hands. And I guess electricity happened between the two of them. And they smiled and they liked each other. I'm sure my dad told him that he was at ITC as well as Atlanta University, and he was going to be a minister as well. And then they went their separate ways. And a few weeks later, and this is seriously just weeks later, my dad had a date with this young lady who was a student at Spelman College. And he called her and he said, he called her early that day. He said, so tonight for our date, I'm going to take you to a concert at Sisters Chapel. And she said, Ralph, thank you so much, but I'm not doing well, and I'm sick. And so I can't go out with you tonight. And my dad was like, well, you're not okay right now, but by this evening, I'm sure you're going to be doing much better. She said, no, this evening, I'm still going to be sick. I can't go with you. And so Daddy was sort of disappointed, and he said, okay, well, listen, I'll just take a rain check and we'll do this date another day. And she said, oh, that's fine. And so my dad arrived early to the concert because he decided, I'm going to go to the concert by myself. He arrived early at the concert, and he's standing outside of Sisters Chapel on this beautiful campus of Spelman College, where they have these huge oak trees. And he sees Martin Luther King, whom he had just met a few weeks prior, standing there. And so he decided, well, I'm early, let me go talk to him. And let's talk about religion. Let's talk about his sermon and whatever. And my dad walked over to Uncle Martin, and as they were talking, Uncle Martin's arm was wrapped around this tree. And he didn't quite understand. And they spoke to each other for a few minutes. And then Daddy said, well, let me just go look. And he went and he looked behind the tree, and behind the tree was this young woman who told my father she was sick. And so, oh my God, I guess there was embarrassment. I guess there was a little bit of laughter. And my dad realized, she had stood him up, and he decided, well, that's okay. I'm going to go on to the concert. And he went on into the concert by himself. But there was a tacit understanding that was exchanged between Uncle Martin and my dad. And so they went to the concert. And I guess right after that, immediately my dad decided he was never going to see that lady again. And I guess Uncle Martin probably at the end of that evening decided he wasn't going to see her again either. But instead, Dad and Uncle Martin started to see each other and hang out with each other. And that's where their friendship began. And so, and then my father completed his degree. And so he went back to Montgomery, Alabama, and went to work at the university, Alabama State University, where he started to teach. He also became the first Black man on the radio in the state of Alabama. And he had a Sunday program, a religious program, so that Black people would tune in and listen and talk about, they'd have devotion and things like that. And Uncle Martin left there and went to Crozier Theological Seminary, and then Uncle Martin went to Boston University, where he met Coretta Scott King. And in the interim period, my dad decided to rekindle this relationship with this young woman named Juanita Jones, my mother, that he had met when he was a soldier during World War II. So he went to college on the GI Bill. So Daddy married Mother. Aunt Coretta and Uncle Martin married each other. And Aunt Coretta was really hesitant to marry Uncle Martin, she said, because he was short. And she didn't think that she wanted to be married to a minister. And my mother married my father simply because she had fallen in love with him when she was his pen pal during the war. She would write letters, and she just thought he was just incredible, this man. But she was disappointed that he was going to be a minister, but she wanted to have them. Anyway, so what happened was that Daddy's back in Alabama, and Uncle Martin is now back in Atlanta because he has found out that there is a position for him, possibly at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. They had kicked out their preacher, Dr. Vernon Johns, because he was too controversial, and he was a rebel rouser, and he wanted Black people to fight. And of course, those were the days of segregation. And Black people had been worn down since the end of Reconstruction by the terror that they received from the Ku Klux Klan and from the White Citizens Council and all of these people who were trying to stop us from voting, who were trying to create this segregated world so that we didn't enjoy any of the liberties that we do today. We couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't go to hotels. We couldn't go to public facilities. We couldn't go in parks. We couldn't use the pools. We couldn't try clothing on in the department stores. The world was entirely separate. Education was separate. But of course, under this principle of Jim Crow segregation, separate was never equal. It was always inferior, especially, through the South. But, basically because of these laws, these Jim Crow laws that were created at the end of Reconstruction, this level of segregation permeated all of America, not just the South. So for people in California who worked in the film industry, you could have been a Black movie star, but you were not allowed to live in a neighborhood beyond that Black neighborhood. You were not going to any of the restaurants, the clubs, the grocery stores, anything that white people were enjoying or participating in. And so the people in Montgomery were afraid, because of their pastor, Dr. Johns. So they kicked him out. But Dr. Johns was my father's mentor, and he was this man who had inspired so much in my father. And my father had already, discovered that during World War II, he had developed rheumatic fever. And in the hospital in England, they told him that he would never live to see 30. And they decided they were going to send him back to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And they sent the rest of his company to the islands off of the coast of Japan. So Black soldiers did not get the opportunity to rest after fighting on the European theater. And so they were shipped to the islands off of the coast of Japan. My dad was shipped back to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. And all of his company that was shipped to the islands off of the coast of Japan were killed, except for one man named Benny and my dad. So, of course, like I said, my dad went to school on that GI Bill. And because they told him he was going to die, he decided that he was going to dedicate whatever time he had left to his life to fight for good. And all of his men in his company had died defending our democracy. Yet every single one of them was denied the privilege to enjoy that same democracy that they had given their lives for. So that, stirred something in my father's soul, which made him cling to Dr. Vernon Johns, who was his mentor. And anyway, so Dr. Johns finds out that Dexter Avenue is going to invite Martin Luther King, this young guy. And they invited Martin because he was young, and they thought they could control him. And that's what they wanted. They wanted somebody to control. And so Dr. Johns decided to take the bus to Atlanta. And then he went to Ebenezer Baptist Church. He met with Granddaddy King. And he said, I hear your son's going to be preaching his trial sermon over there at my church, Dexter Avenue. Can I ride with your son to Montgomery? Because I'm going to be preaching too that same Sunday over at First Baptist Church for a young minister friend of mine. The names were never exchanged. And so Granddaddy said, sure, what, my son, you can ride with my son. And so they rode together, and along that drive, that's when Dr. John started to talk about to Uncle Martin, to demotivate him, to tell him, listen, young man, you're not ready for this. You're not equipped to handle what is the crisis in Montgomery, Alabama. He tried to demotivate them. Finally, they got to my parents' house, and my dad said he walked out on the porch and he saw Vernon coming, and he was so excited, but he saw this teeny weeny little figure coming up behind Dr. Johns, who was much taller than Uncle Martin. And Daddy said he didn't recognize him at first, but then when he finally got there on the porch in the light, he saw it was Martin, and he said, oh my goodness, he was so happy. He said, it was like God had brought his friend to his door, his friend from those college years and graduate school years. Anyway, they got inside and they sat down and they broke bread. And they got a chance to eat. And while they were eating, Dr. John started to talk about the crises of the Negro in Montgomery, Alabama, and what was happening on the buses. And let's go to the next slide. So that's my dad as the soldier. The sad thing about all of this is that when he died, my mother requested an American flag from the military to lay across my father's coffin. That's all she wanted, because that was a transformative moment for my father. And also that's when she first became aware of him, because she would write those pen pal letters to him. And unfortunately, they said no. So he was never allowed to have that flag. And this is Uncle Martin, I guess. I think he's graduating from Morehouse at this place. So here they are, they're two couples. So anyway, what happened was, while they're having this conversation with Dr. Johns, Uncle Martin was, a little timid. And so he left them that night, and he went and prepared for, to where he was staying to prepare for his sermon the following morning. And Dr. John stayed at my parents' house. And then early the next morning, my dad had to go to the radio station to do his radio show. And at the end of my dad's radio show, Uncle Martin called, and he was nervous. So Daddy said to him, listen, this is what I want you to do. I want you to get down on your knees, and I'm going to get down on my knees. And then together we're going to pray. And my dad decided he was going to pray, and he prayed. My dad was a powerful minister, and he was a great prayer. He could pray like nobody else. And he lifted Uncle Martin's spirits, and he told him what he needed to do, and that you needed to go forth and you just need to shine. And so that Uncle Martin could be elected pastor of Dexter Avenue. Well, Dr. John's plan was to have everybody at First Baptist so that no one important would be over there at Dexter to hear Uncle Martin speak. And I'd have to say half the congregation was not there that day. They were waiting, they were listening to Dr. John's in my father's pulpit. But my father was praying the whole time that Uncle Martin would get elected pastor. And because he had inspired Uncle Martin so much, Uncle Martin delivered the most prolific sermon. And at the close of his sermon, the deacons and the chairman of the deacon board immediately offered him the pastorate of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And Dr. Johns was so disappointed, but Daddy was happy and Uncle Martin was happy because they were back together. And so they moved to Montgomery, and they were two couples. And during these years, my mother had my sister, and Aunt Coretta had Yoki. So they were, parents with two little daughters who loved each other, who shared the crib together. And then they had their wives who really liked each other as well. And it was the days of segregation. So you couldn't go to a restaurant. And my mother was a master chef, or she was learning to become this master chef that Uncle Martin loved and adored. So they would have dinner at our house one night, and then the next night they'd have dinner at Aunt Coretta's house, and they would basically go back and forth as, couples. And that's the way they did their thing. And they did everything together. And Uncle Martin was writing on his dissertation, and Daddy was planning to then go and get his doctorate, because my dad was still working over at Alabama State. He was the dean of men over at the school, plus he was the pastor of the church, and he was also teaching sociology at the college. But what happened was Rosa Parks got arrested. But what I want to tell you was that my dad was, there was something called the Women's Political Committee, because there were issues that Black women were having on the buses. So Rosa Parks was not the first person. She was the third person to be arrested on the Montgomery bus. The first person was Claudette Colvin, which is a young teenage girl. The second person was a young woman named Mary Louise, and I don't remember her last name, Mary Louise, but she was an unwed mother. And so because there was a different time and people were very strict in their morality, Black people would not get behind an unmarried Black woman to make her as the symbol for the movement or for boycotting the buses. And Joanne Robinson, another professor, she was an English professor at Alabama State. She had created this women's political committee that was dealing with the issues that Black women were primarily experiencing on the bus. So what happened, so you understand what happened on the bus, what we would do is we would get on the bus, you walk up to the bus and you put your money in. When you're Black, you'd have to get off of the bus. You'd have to walk to the back door, and then you got on the bus. Oftentimes, you put your money in, and by the time you got to the back door, that bus driver had taken off and left you, and your money was gone. There was another situation where this person had gone to the back door and was halfway on, and the door shut, and the bus took off. So the people had to hold on to this person as the body is hanging half in and off of the bus until they got to the next stop. And the bus driver controlled the bus. And so on the day of Rosa Parks, of her arrest, Rosa Parks was seated in the Negro section, and that's what we were called back then, Negroes. She was seated in the Negro section, but there was a white man who wanted to sit in that section. Apparently, maybe the bus was full. He did not want to stand, he wanted to sit. So he said, you all have to move. So it was a row full of Black people. Everyone else got up and moved to the back and stood. Because of course the Negro section was totally full, and of course it was smaller than the white section. And, but Rosa remained there because she was seated in the designated area for Black people. And so they called to the bus driver. So then the bus driver pulls the bus over, and then he goes back and says to Rosa Parks, you better move. And apparently they had had an exchange prior to this particular occasion, December 1st, 1955. And so Rosa was determined. So she moved from her seat on the aisle and slid over by the window to let them know, I'm not moving. I'm following the law. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm not going to move. And now Rosa Parks, just so you understand, is not a controversial figure. She's a 42-year-old seamstress. She was married. She had just completed a full day of work as a seamstress at the White's department store, and she was tired. And she was following the law. She was seated where she was supposed to be seated. And the bus driver was angry. So he got off and he got the police, and the police came and they arrested her. And yeah, there she is. That's her mugshot. And she was the sweetest, most gentle person. We used to call, my mother's family calls her Cousin Rosa, because my mother's second oldest sister married Uncle Morris Percival, and Morris Percival's first cousin was Rosa Parks. So to my mother's family, she was Cousin Rosa. And when she was arrested, my dad said, well, number one, Edie Nixon said, Ralph, we've got to do something. Edie Nixon was head of the Montgomery NAACP. My dad was the number 2 man at the Montgomery NAACP. Rosa Parks was the secretary at the Montgomery NAACP. And so Edie Nixon, because he was a Pullman porter, had to leave immediately to go out of town. He said, Ralph, we've got to do something. My dad said, I've got this, we'll do this. We're going to organize, I'll speak to the ministers and we'll organize a boycott. So this would be my dad's 3rd boycott, but of course this would be Montgomery's first boycott. And so my dad spoke to Joanne Robinson and they set a plan in action. My dad said to Edie Nixon, listen, I need you to call my friend Martin. He's new in town. People don't know him, but would you call him and get him involved? But before Edie Nixon could call Uncle Maude, Daddy called him and told him what he was going to do. And my dad had learned the power of boycotting when he was in high school. He went to Linden Academy High School, and at Linden Academy High School, he challenged the theory of separate but equal. And because my dad was, a mathematician, and he was interested in science, there was an inferior science department. And so he decided that and he needed to write letters to the Board of Education because they didn't have a Bunsen burner and they did not have any equipment in the science department. And of course, the teachers were very upset, but he went home and in front of his parents, he wrote this letter, and his mother and father encouraged him. And he wrote the letter. And of course, the Board of Education wanted to know, who is this David Abernathy who's writing us this letter demanding the equal equivalent at the Negro Linden Academy? But they were, astonished, but also intrigued that this young man was requesting the same equipment. And so they gave it to the school. So that was his first boycott. His second boycott was at Alabama State, where he was president of the student body. And the food was inferior, and he decided he was going to boycott the cafeteria. And for almost a week, none of the students ate in the cafeteria because the food was inferior. And if the teachers and the faculty were getting better food, why couldn't the students get the same thing? And so, the cafeteria and the president and everybody was outraged because that food was being wasted. And they finally agreed to give students better food. And so that was my dad's second boycott. So the Montgomery bus boycott would be my dad's 3rd boycott. And so he, the following morning after Rosa Parks was arrested and Edie Nixon had called Uncle Maude to officially get him to join, that following morning, my dad met the Black ministers And they were the Baptist ministers, not the Methodists or the Catholic, because in the Methodist church, you have to follow a bishop and do what the bishop says. And if you're Catholic, you have to follow, I guess, the archdiocese or however that works. But in the Baptist church, the Baptist minister basically governs himself. And my dad met those ministers and he told them what needed to happen. And he issued the call for the creation of what would be known as the Civil Rights Movement. And then he left those ministers and went over to the college and picked up the flyers that Joanne Robinson had been running off in secret, because of course this couldn't be well known that university professors were mimeographing flyers asking people to stay off of the buses. And he met them. He met Joanne, they collected and they went to the school children when they were leaving school and they distributed them. Simultaneously, my mother was at home typing out flyers as well and cutting them and giving them to little children in the neighborhood to pass out to give to their parents so that the word would spread. And so what happened was Daddy and Joanne gave the flyer to one of these children whose mother was a maid for a white family. So the following day, this Black lady went to work at the white woman's house and she said, ma'am, they're asking us to stay off of the buses on December 5th. So could I please have that day off? And the woman said, no, you can't have that day off. You have got to come to work. Give me that piece of paper. She saw it, she read it, and then she decided, oh, well, I've got to take this to the newspaper. So she went down to the Montgomery Advertiser, which is the newspaper, and she gave it to the newspaper people. And she said, now, you see what they're trying to do? So the man who was head of the newspaper, he said, well, then let me run a full page ad in the paper to alert everybody to what the Black people are doing, because he was under the assumption that Black people wouldn't read. You know, we were supposedly ignorant. We wouldn't buy the newspaper, we wouldn't know. And so they planned that for that Sunday. But on the days leading up, my dad went to pick up Uncle Martin, who said, listen, I can't do anything. I can't, because I'm writing on my dissertation. But you know what? You can use my church for one of these mass meetings that you want to have. And Daddy was like, okay, but you know what? I'm going to pick you up and make you come with me. And Uncle Martin's like, I'm busy. And so Daddy would drive to the house, pick up Uncle Martin and make him go with him. And it wasn't until the third meeting that Uncle Martin officially joined. And the chairman of the Deacon Board at Dexter Avenue nominated Uncle Martin as the head of this organization because he was Dr. King. And if you were Dr. somebody, they felt that the white community would respect you more because of the amount of education that you had. And so that's how Uncle Martin was chosen as the head of the organization. He became the president. My dad, who organized everything, was given the title of vice president. And then my dad named the organization as the Montgomery Improvement Organization, Montgomery Improvement Association, so that it didn't have any connection to the NAACP. It would be an entity independent and on its own. And so the flyer was in the newspaper on Sunday. And in the interim period, they had the mass meetings, and they also went to the pool halls to meet the men, because the women filled the churches for the mass meeting, because it was women who were literally these facilitators of change. And that Sunday, that ad ran, and everybody that didn't go to the mass meetings, or everybody that they didn't reach in the pool halls or the barber shops, or didn't get the message word of mouth, they saw it in the newspaper. And by seeing it in the newspaper, it was official, and everybody knew that everybody Black was going to stay off of the buses. So early that Monday morning, the 5th, Uncle Martin arrived at our house. We lived 1327 South Hall Street. They lived over on Jackson Avenue. And the bus would round the corner by our house first, and then go to their house, and then on the way up into the white neighborhood. Well, Mother and Daddy and Uncle Martin was standing in the window. And when the bus rounded the corner, normally Mother said the bus was at least half full of Black people. But when it rounded, and it'd be Black women because they were maids, when it rounded the corner, there was not a soul on that bus. Mother said they jumped up and down, they were screaming, they were so excited because that meant, oh my God, we've organized, something literally worked. So then Daddy and Uncle Martin got dressed and they went on down there to the courthouse because that morning of the 5th was Rosa's trial date. And so here they got dressed, and you can see my dad and Uncle Martin headed to the courthouse. And this is them that particular day. And next to them is this man, Bayard Rustin, who had come down from an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is out of Nyack, New York. And he came to introduce the idea of nonviolence to them. Well, because, you know, they hadn't thought about violence versus nonviolence. They didn't know anything about it. But Bayard introduced the idea, and that this would be nonviolent, like Gandhi's movement was in India. And they entertained it, and they liked the idea. Anyway, the crowds they just kept this boycott, which was supposed to be one day, went to day 2 and day 3 and day 4, and all of the Black people were staying off of the buses. There were some Black people who would be walking, and the Ku Klux Klan would see them, these white men, and beat them up and try and force them to get on the buses, and they refused to get on the buses. And so it was just a momentum that just kept building, and it was building because we were so hungry for our freedom. We arrived in the United States of America in 1619. We arrived before the Mayflower sailed into Plymouth Harbor with the Pilgrims. We'd been here one whole full year before that. We arrived at the mouth of the James River to Jamestown to harvest the tobacco crop. We worked from sunup to sundown, building this country. We were the free labor force that made everything happen. Yet we were never allowed to assimilate into the population. We were never allowed to enjoy the freedoms or anything. And so we were hungry for our freedom. And the other thing people need to understand, the first person to give their red blood to bring our nation into being was a Black man. His name was Crispus Attucks, and there's a monument to him in Boston, Massachusetts, and the public gardens there. But the rest of America doesn't seem to realize that, because he was a true revolutionary and was ready to die and fight for our independence from England, from the United Kingdom. So this was how much we loved this land that we had built. And so, yes, we were hungry for our freedom. And here you get a chance to see, these are ministers all standing behind my dad and beside my dad as he tries to calm down the crowd, because they've just entered the church, which is my dad's church right there, First Baptist, and the crowd just went crazy. Daddy said they went to one of the mass meetings early on, and he said they couldn't even park anywhere near the church, and he didn't know what had happened, what was happening. All these people, all these cars, and then there were people outside of the church. He wasn't sure. And then he said when he walked in, he and Uncle Martin walked in, the people just applauded and they went crazy. And he was like, he couldn't believe. He said that was his earliest knowledge or memory of them being celebrated as leaders of this bus boycott. And it was just tremendous. Tremendous. Oh, I did the wrong thing. Let's see the next one. There they are outside of a bus. And that's Uncle Martin. I hope you can see the arrow. And you can see the bus is totally empty as it goes down the street. And that's Daddy. And that's my father's assistant. And this is E.D. Nixon, who was head of the Montgomery NAACP. And my dad had to have an assistant because at this point he's working 2 places. Not only is he pastor of the church, but he's also over at the university, dean of men at the college. And so, of course, he was overworked, but he was so thrilled. And you can see on Uncle Martin's face this shyness because he's younger, they're in their 20s at that point, he's younger and he's really shy. He hadn't grown into the man that we would come to know. And my dad was, just proud of the success that they were achieving. And this is my dad being arrested. So what happened was the courts decided that it was illegal to have a boycott in Montgomery, and for people to stay off of the buses. They, however they decided to, write some laws that changed the things, it was illegal. And so by making it illegal, they decided to arrest people. And so my dad was in the first group of people to be arrested. And at that point, Uncle Martin had gone to Atlanta. So when my dad got out of jail, you had to pay the bail, and he got out that same day. He called Uncle Martin and he said, listen, they've arrested me and a few other ministers. And I think you need to come on back here and get arrested. And so Uncle Martin said, okay, I'll call you when I get back. And then when he got back, he called my dad on the phone and he said, I don't want to go by myself. I'm nervous. Will you go with me? And Daddy said, okay. And so that's Daddy there with Uncle Martin as he's about to be arrested. And he's got his hands behind his back because of course they're in cuffs and the handcuffs. And my dad is listening as he tells Uncle Martin what he needs to do. And Uncle Martin's lips are pursed because he's, shy. He was very shy, actually, sometimes, especially when I was growing up, seeing him. Anyway, so there he is with his mugshot. And you can see the youth and insecurity and uncertainty on his face. And then they had, once they got out, the churches, oh my goodness, so sorry. The churches developed, the churches purchased vehicles so that people could be transported from around the city. And this church bus, I'm not sure which Baptist church it belongs to, but there wasn't an insurance company in the United States of America that would insure these vehicles. So they had to get insurance from Lloyd's of London. But by buying these station wagons, they became a mode of transportation. There were black cabs as well as people who owned cars who could pick people up and take them. And when that didn't happen, people walked. And then during that period, they needed to learn as much as they could about nonviolence. And so here they are at the Highlander Folk School in Mount Eagle, Tennessee, where they're actually learning nonviolence. And when they were trying to learn nonviolence, they tried to say that they were communists. And they were not communists by any stretch of the imagination. They weren't even socialists. All we were asking for was our rights as American citizens to be entitled to everything that everybody else was, according to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So that's Uncle Martin right there. And behind him is Pete Seeger, who wrote the song We Shall Overcome. And then the little girl is Karis Horton, Miles Horton's daughter. And then next to her is Rosa Parks and my dad. And then they're celebrating here in this particular photograph because they're leaving the courthouse and they're victorious. They've won, so that they've won the rights to legally boycott the buses. And then this is just Uncle Martin in church, because he was a pastor. More than anything, they were pastors. And that was the most important thing. They believed that they were doing God's will. And my dad used to say in Montgomery, and it's also in my book, that if we die, then our blood would cry out from the earth, because we were destined to do this. This, of course, would be the first time that a whole community of more than 50,000 Black people would come together to stand up for our freedom, for what's morally right, for justice, for equality. And this, I love this because this is just a newspaper article, and it says how and why this young pastor became leader of a bus boycott. And it talks about Uncle Martin, and it talks about my dad and the two of them and what they were trying to do together, but why Martin? And it was just divine. It was just a chance. My dad used to say that they were ordinary men put in an extraordinary circumstance, and they rose to the occasion. And that's how it happened. It was so very, very simple. And here they're on the bus. So what you also need to understand is that Bayard Rustin had come down and introduced the idea of nonviolence, but Bayard Rustin could not stay because that was also the time when people discriminated against people based on their sexuality. And Bayard Rustin was a homosexual. And the Black community and the Black ministers in Montgomery, Alabama were not comfortable with him being an openly gay, flamboyant Black man. So he had to leave. And that's unfortunate. But thankfully, Glenn Smiley came down, and Glenn Smiley is this man right here. He was from Pasadena, just a wonderful man, Glenn. And so he came down and he taught Uncle Martin and Daddy the principles of nonviolence. And we would reconnect, Glenn and I, during after the Rodney King verdict, when Los Angeles was burning. We would find each other in the midst of that. And then every week after that, once a week, I would go to Glenn's church, and he would teach me, and he would talk with Reverend Jim Lawson as well. He would teach us all about nonviolence. But yeah. And so whenever you see Martin Luther King on the bus with a white man, that white man is Glenn Smiley. And so in response to that, they bombed my parents' home, and they bombed my parents' home. They used to call every morning and every evening from the beginning. So the bus boycott went on for 381 days. And once we had the legal right to stay on the bus, you know, the white supremacists were really, really angry. And so they decided they were going to retaliate. And Daddy and Uncle Martin decided they were going to create a whole new organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And they were all going to go to Atlanta because the meeting was going to convene in Atlanta at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And it was going to be the, you know, great thing. And my mother didn't want to go because she was pregnant with me. And she didn't want to take my sister, who was a toddler. My sister at that point was 3 years of age. She did not want to take my sister to Mama King's house, she said. So she told my dad she was going to stay behind. And she'd fallen asleep watching TV. They had called that morning and told her, you know, they called her the N-word, and they said, they're going to kill you. But that's what they did every morning for over 381 days. And then they do it again in the evening for over 381 days. So mother just, you know, just threw it off like, oh yeah, that's just the regular hate call that we would receive. But on this particular evening, they decided to make good on their promise. Mother had fallen asleep in the living room. Something awakened her. She was watching late night TV, the Jack Parr show. Something awakened her. She got up. She and the dog Brownie, our little Cocker Spaniel, went back into the bedroom. My mother checked on my sister in the crib. She got in the bed and she was fast asleep. 15 minutes later, the entire front of the house exploded. And so the police arrived immediately because they knew what was going to happen. And they arrived and they started roping off my parents' home. And Mrs. Arthur Mae Norris came up the street, an older Black woman in her 60s, and they tried to stop everybody. They wanted to leave my mother alone in the house. And Mrs. Arthur Mae Norris gave a look to this white older police officer, and she gave him a look like, don't you dare try to stop me after you all have done this. Because back then, the law enforcement was a part of the Ku Klux Klan. And she marched on into my mother's house. She cleared a space for my mother and she sat her down and she picked up the telephone and she proceeded to call my dad at Granddaddy King's house. And Daddy's on the phone. Granddaddy King is upset. It's the middle of the night, in the wee hours of the morning, and he's upset. Big Mama is up, Uncle Martin's mother. She's upset. Uncle Retta is like really timid. She's at the end of the hall. And sure enough, while my mother is on the phone with my father explaining that everything is okay, there's a second explosion. And Arthur May runs to the door to look. You can see the flames and everything from the explosion. And she can hear she saw the reporter run to this same older white police officer. And he said to the officer, "Where to?" And the officer said, "Go to Ripley Street." Well, Ripley Street was my dad's church. It was First Baptist. And First Baptist was right across the street from the police station. So Arthur May ran back inside. Daddy and Uncle Martin and everybody could hear the explosion through the telephone. And my mother said, Arthur May said to my mother, "It's First Baptist. They bombed Reverend's church." And that's my dad. At that point, he just dropped to his knees. He didn't quite know what to do. Uncle Martin took the phones, talked to mother for a few minutes, and then together they got down on their knees. And right after that, that would be the third explosion. And then there would be the fourth and the fifth explosion. And Uncle Martin, in his book, Stride Towards Freedom, he wrote that with Ralph's home and church bombed, all we could do is get down on our knees and pray and ask the Lord to give us the strength to carry on. And so the following early in the morning, they got in the car and Uncle Martin drove Daddy back down to Montgomery. He left Uncle Retta there alone to conduct the first meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And once they got back, they went to the church first to see, and the church was really devastated. So just so you understand, they bombed my parents' home. They bombed my dad's First Baptist Church. They bombed Bell Street Church. They bombed Mount Olive Church. And then they bombed the home of Reverend Robert Gratz, a white minister to an all-Black congregation. They bombed Reverend Gratz because they thought that no white man should be associated with Black people, and that we're going to bomb your home to teach you a lesson to stay in your place. But the Gratz bombing was not as devastating as our home or my dad's church, which was almost nearly demolished. That's the flyer. They wrote, "They bombed our homes and our churches," and my dad was speaking about it. And then very shortly thereafter, Uncle Martin, of course, had written this book, Stride Towards Freedom. And so his publisher, Harper and Row, wanted him to do a book signing in New York and Harlem. And he went to New York to do that book signing. And as he's signing books, this very deranged Black woman walked up to him and she said, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And he says, "Yes, I'm Martin Luther King." And she took the letter opener that's there, right there, and stabbed him in the chest. And it was headed straight to the main artery to his heart. He used to tell us when we were little, if he had sneezed, he would have died because the tip of the letter opener was touching the artery, but thank goodness it did not pierce the artery or the aorta. I think it's called the aorta, but it was very devastating. Anyway, I like this because you get this chance to see the young family. So I was born at that point, and that's Martin in Ancaretta's arms. And that's Yoki. We called her Yoki. Her real name is Yolanda. And Uncle Martin and Ancaretta. And they're moving to Atlanta because Montgomery was too dangerous. And Granddaddy King has offered Uncle Martin a job as the co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so they leave. And so when they leave, Uncle Martin is devastated that, he and Daddy are separated. And so he starts calling every day. His secretary is this lady named Maud, and she'd call and check in with my dad, and Uncle Martin was like, you need to come here, you need to be with us, you need to be with us. And Daddy was like, I can't. Montgomery's home and Alabama's my home, and we're fine here. And my mother said to Uncle Martin, we're not moving to Atlanta, Georgia, unless my husband has a church. We're not moving just to continue working on the movement and to continue our friendship. That's just not happening. So during that time, Granddaddy King is on a mission then to find a church so that his son will be settled and to find a church for my dad. But so the Freedom Riders, the Congress of Racial Equality, decided they were going to test the interstate continental rules for transit on buses, on Greyhound and Trailways buses. And so those students got on that bus. They were black and white, and their buses were going to different destinations. This particular bus was headed to Anniston, Alabama. They had another bus headed to Birmingham and another bus headed to Montgomery. Well, when that bus got to Anniston, as it was leaving Anniston, the Ku Klux Klan and the white supremacists threw Molotov cocktails at the bus and set the bus on fire. They were angry that black and white people were sitting together on the bus. And there you see the bus, it's burning. The people had to get off of it. And this is James Peck. His father owned a store called Peck and Peck, a department store. And he says they beat him unmercifully for being on that bus seated with black people. There he is again, the man that he was riding with, and that segregation is morally wrong. You see it, and you see the CORE sign behind him. That's a CORE for Congress of Racial Equality. Anyway, so when the bus got to Birmingham, they beat those people as well. The police stood back and disappeared. But when the bus got to Montgomery, because this is the Montgomery bus, Jim Zwerg is this man who's lying in the bed. It's ZWERG. They got off of the bus and the white supremacists proceeded to beat them unmercifully. John Siegenthaler was on that bus as well. And these people were so angry that they beat this young man, and he had to go to the black hospital because the white hospital, or it's like a black clinic, because the white hospital wouldn't accept them. So Daddy decided that he was going to have a mass meeting. So he called Uncle Maude and he said, this has happened over here. Come on down here to Montgomery. And it's only like a few hours away. So Uncle Martin got in his car and he drove on down, and they decided to have a mass meeting at my dad's church that night. And Congressman John Lewis was among this group, but he wasn't a congressman at that point. He was just a young man. And they had hit him and opened up his skull. And with, I guess, a bottle, I'm not quite sure. John says that's when he developed a speech impediment because he believed that, his brain had been injured. Anyway, there were white people that attended this mass meeting, and they were upset that Virginia Durr, who was a white woman, had attended this mass meeting. So the white supremacists flipped over her car, which is the car that's flipped over right here. And they set it on fire, which I don't have in this presentation, but they set Virginia Durr's car on fire. And they said they were going to kill everybody. They surrounded the church. They were going to kill everybody in the church. And so they had a meeting, but then there was nothing they could do. Everybody had to stay there. And here you can see the people are sleeping, They're sleeping on the pews, and Uncle Martin is in my dad's office and his chair, frustrated. They don't know what to do. So they've called the White House and they're in contact with Robert Kennedy, who's talking back and forth to Governor Patterson. So Governor Patterson decides, so listen, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get the police and a few good men, and they will protect the people. And Bobby Kennedy is like, they're not gonna protect the people. That's the police. These are white supremacists and they're Klansmen. That's not good enough. I'll send in the National Guard. Well, Governor Patterson was so upset that Bobby Kennedy was, as Attorney General, was sending in the National Guard. He decided to declare martial law. Anyway, so here you see the people in the wee hours of the morning leaving the church with the National Guard, with their weapons. They were able to get into the trucks, and the trucks would drive people home to their neighborhoods, where they could then leave and walk to their doors safely without any injury. And of course, the governor and the police and the white supremacists were so angry that the Attorney General of the United States has sent in the National Guard. And here you can see the National Guard. They ensured our protection. And so the following morning, they decided to have their press conference. And this is in my parents' home. So that's Congressman John Lewis right there. That's Uncle Martin, that's my dad. And this is Wyatt T. Walker, who was the new executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And these white men are members of the press. And I'll never forget that day, because I wakened in the morning and there were all these white people there in my parents' house on the floor. It was something different. I mean, I was used to white people coming there to the home to participate in meetings that they had in the house, but this was different. And I remember, and this right here is James Foreman in the corner right over here. James Foreman, and yeah. And so he was head of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And then you can see the side view, and right there is our little rocking horse right there. That's our horse. And this is all the media. But it was a transformative moment for me as a little girl, because I got a chance to see, and you can see the bandage on John Lewis's head where they had literally severely injured him. So then, and at that press conference, they announced that the Freedom Rides would continue. And they would continue with the National Guard on the buses, and they would go on all the way to Mississippi, to Louisiana, and hopefully on to Texas. But the National Guardsmen would be on the buses, and you can see the National Guard there all lining, protecting, stopping the white supremacists from attacking. So what was interesting was that morning, they also went into the white area in the bus station and sat in that white area. So, and no one said anything. So this is the following day after my dad decided, Uncle Martin had gone back to Atlanta. My dad said, okay, we're gonna do this again. So he walked into the white waiting room and sat down at the lunch counter. My dad, with Bernard Lee, his student from Alabama State that he had gotten to join them. And I guess this white man here decided to join them as well. And so the policeman is grabbing the white man first, and then he's gonna grab the black people, and you can see the angriness in their faces, that how can they dare, sit down in our lunch counter. And here is this, you can see the sign, they're exiting the white waiting room and restaurant. And there's my dad, and that's Bernard, and that white minister as they get into that paddy wagon to go to jail. And my dad has a smile on his face, because now he's doing something good. Because like I said before, he thought he was going to die by the time he was 30. So he wanted his life to have purpose, and he wanted to fight for us to enjoy that very same democracy. And here the Congress of Racial Equality students are protesting all over the United States of America for justice and equality, just like young people are protesting today. And so right after, with the success of Montgomery, they went to Albany. And here you see the students taking a knee. I went too far. They took a knee. And then here's Daddy and Uncle Martin trying to integrate a lunch counter. And in Albany, they were arrested. And so Mother and Ankaretta went down to be with them, and see, they're here, they're getting ready to go to jail. And they always prided themselves in how they presented themselves. And so they are surrounded, behind them are police officers, and that's inside the jail. And the Black man in the light suit jacket is Dr. Anderson, who was head of the Albany movement. And here they are leaving the jail at Albany after they had been arrested. And then they've become, veterans at going to jail and fighting for freedom and standing up for our rights. And so now we're in Birmingham. And in Birmingham, we were not allowed to try clothing on at the department store. So they decided to come and support Reverend Shuttlesworth, who is the first Black man right there with the dark jacket. He was a pastor in Birmingham, and he wasn't getting enough support from the community. And so he appealed to Daddy and Uncle Maude, and he was also a member of the newly formed Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He said, please come and support me and help me do this thing in Birmingham. So they said, okay, we'll go down there. But they couldn't go earlier like they wanted to, because there was a mayoral runoff election between Bull Connor, the police chief, and Albert Boutwell, who was running for a city councilman who was running for mayor. And if they had been in Montgomery earlier, in Birmingham earlier, their presence would have made people afraid, and therefore Bull Connor, the police chief, would have been elected as mayor, and they did not want that to happen. So they said, we'll wait, and we'll lag back, and we'll let the people of Birmingham do their thing. And Albert Boutwell talked more sense than that police chief who was full of hate. And so they had to get rid of, they got rid of him and elected Albert Boutwell. And this is the first day after the election. And this is the first demonstration of the boycott. And here you see them with Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, Daddy and Uncle Maude, surrounded by the press, asking them, so you all are in this town now, what are you all gonna do? And how are you gonna do it? And that's them at a press conference, getting their heads together about what they were gonna do. And what they did was they boycotted the department stores and the lunch counters. But by stopping Black people from purchasing items, which was incredible, at Easter, they would shut down commerce. They would shut down the department stores, because white people weren't buying all of these new clothes at Easter, but Black people were. And why were we going to spend our money in the department store and when we couldn't try clothing on? You couldn't even try that hat on. If it touched your hair, you had to have it. So what was the point in doing it? So we weren't going to do it. And so we were going to wear dungarees and all of that stuff. And no one was buying. And so the merchants were really upset, and they went to Daddy and Uncle Maude and said, don't do this. So Daddy and Uncle Maude, they've met that morning in their hotel with these, concerned clergy. And they begged them not to do it. And Uncle Maude listened to them, and he said, listen, I've decided I need to talk to Ralph. And he said to my dad, listen, I know that you need to be at your church, because at this point we've moved to Atlanta. You need to be at your church. And Daddy was like, no. He said, but it's going to be Easter Sunday and you're not going to have anybody. And Dad will be over there at the pulpit of Ebenezer. Please don't do this. I'll do this alone. And Daddy said to Uncle Maude, do you think I'm going to let you do this alone? You're not doing this alone. This is us. We're a team. We do this together. which gave Uncle Martin a great sigh of relief. And so they turned back to the ministers in the room and they said, gentlemen, thank you so much for your concern, but we have a crowd of people waiting for us at 16th Street Baptist Church, and that's where we're going. And so that's what they did. They left and they started this march called the Good Friday March. And you see them in their dungarees and they're ready to go to jail. And they're met by the police. And everybody got down on their knees. And before Daddy and Uncle Martin could get down on their knees, they're pulled by their necks, by the collar of their shirt and the seat of their pants. And you can see they're taken to the paddy wagon and they're thrown into the paddy wagon. And that's Uncle Martin's mugshot. And they separated them at that jail. And by separating them, they thought that they could, defeat Uncle Martin. That was their plan. And yeah. But when Uncle Martin was left to brood in that little empty cell where they had no mattress, no linen, my dad said it was on the floor where he was sleeping. And you can see, this is the telegram that they sent to the White House, that they were confined in solitary confinement. They said it was for their own safety. But they didn't have any modicum of human treatment and no light in that cell. But they were allowed to walk together outside in a safe little area. Once a day, they'd be let out into the sunlight. And my dad said it was incredibly inhumane and it was horrible. But Uncle Martin left to brood on little pieces of toilet paper. He wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail to these concerned clergy as to why we could no longer wait for our freedom. That's them in jail. That's Mother and Uncle Coretta visiting them at the jail with Reverend Shuttlesworth, who was not in jail with them. And that's just the cover of Jet magazine, where they write about Uncle Martin. They don't mention Daddy's name here. They just mention Reverend M.L. King, M.L. King. That's what they used to call him, M.L., a lot of people. And then the people around the rest of America decided to protest to support him and to support them. And so the students over at, once they finally got out, the students decided we're gonna protest. We're gonna do this. We're gonna march to City Hall, and the goal is to get to City Hall and get on our knees and pray. And this is what the students were gonna do. And it was primarily led by female students. And you can see the girls that are doing it, that are leading it. The women were the facilitators. The girls always outnumbered the boys. But the boys were there, but the girls were the ones who were the strongest and who were just determined because we were hungry for our freedom. And so the police decided that they were going to arrest them for having signs, don't buy segregation, and trying to stop Black people from purchasing in these department stores. And they even arrested children. Children would leave school, from elementary school and high school, and leave school and march. And this one little girl, they asked this one little girl, the policeman, as he's putting her in the paddy wagon, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "I want to be free." And who could blame her? And these are children that are about to be arrested. They are actually being arrested and taken to jail. I love this one because it says, "Can a man love God and hate his brother? God whom you cannot see and your brother who you can see? Yet you can hate this man you can see in front of you, who has only been good, who's only served you, who's never harassed you, who's never killed you, who's never maimed you, raped you, robbed you. Why would you hate him because his skin is a different color?" They turn the water hoses on these young people. You can see the water hoses that speak for themselves, these photographs. These are children who were fighting for their freedom. The adults are standing back watching. and it's the children. And Glenn Smiley said that he was there, of course, with us in Montgomery and in Birmingham and in Selma. But he said the power of the water hose was so great, he watched it peel the bark off of the trees in Kelly Ingram Park, where these students were congregated across from 16th Street Baptist Church. You can just see the pictures speak for themselves. And the power of the water hose just knocked people to the ground. Just knocked them and saturated them. And this white tank that you see behind, like they're at war, is what the police chief, Bull Connor, used to ride around in. He thought he needed a tank, like he was at war with Black people, with Negroes. He needed to control us that way. Here you can see the people. So this is day 2 of this protest. On day 2, everybody sat down on the ground so that when the firemen came with the water hoses, they wouldn't be able to knock them down, but they still pointed them so directly at you. And here you see the people seated on the ground. It's so powerful, it knocked that man, to rip that man's shirt off, and you can see his naked back. And you can see the terror in the people's faces, the young Black women's faces. So here, Daddy and Shuttlesworth and Uncle Martin planning what they're gonna do. And that's them at a hotel where they stayed, the Gadsden Motel, the only Black or Negro hotel. They had a press conference and everybody showed up. And this is when they've decided to make a truce with this, the white merchants. And they're gonna call off the boycott for a few days and have a waiting period, a grace period, and see what they can settle. And Daddy and Uncle Martin made some concerns. They stated their concerns to this committee. And then Daddy and Uncle Martin decided to go to Atlanta for a rest, for this little cooling off period, to go home for a moment. And people wanted them to stay, but they decided they were gonna leave. And I went too far. What happened was, when we were there, they were there at that particular hotel. They went upstairs and they picked up their bags out of the hotel. They got in Reverend Shuttles, no, it was Reverend, was Y.T. Walker's car. And Reverend Cross, it was with Reverend Cross, the pastor of 16th Street Baptist Church. And as they pulled away from the hotel and they got ready to round the corner, their hotel room exploded. They had placed a bomb there. And if they had stayed 15 minutes longer in that hotel room, they would have died or been lying there, dying from the power of the explosion, because it literally decimated their hotel room. President Kennedy was extremely concerned. So this is a copy of the telegram that he sent to my dad, asking them to come to Washington to meet, to convene, to discuss the civil rights problem and what was happening there in Birmingham, Alabama. President Kennedy was very forward in his beliefs about human rights and civil rights. And of course, the people of the South were upset with President Kennedy because of his stand on civil rights. Mrs. Kennedy said that ultimately her husband was assassinated because of his stand on civil rights. And here, after that meeting, that's my dad addressing the media with Fred Shuttlesworth, as he talks about what they need to do in order to move forward. And that's just the couples, Daddy and Uncle Martin, and Mother and Uncle Retta. As they, from there, they went to Hollywood, where they met all the movie stars. Burt Lancaster had a gathering at his house, and Gwen Green, the lady, a friend of mine who just died yesterday, she was 96 years of age. She worked for Daddy and Uncle Martin in Los Angeles, and she was there to help set up this event at Burt Lancaster's house. And then on that particular day, Marlon Brando wrote the check for $50,000 that he donated to the civil rights movement. And Gwen went over to collect the check. My dad sent her to collect the check after he finished speaking with Brando. Because I guess he met with other people. There were a lot of movie stars. That's Tony Franciosa, that's Paul Newman, Polly Bergen, Joanne Woodward, another actress behind. I don't know that minister, Sammy Davis and Uncle Modern, and of course, Brando. And yeah, they were all coming together in Burt Lancaster's house, demanding freedom. And it was because of movie stars and people of celebrity who gave their support to this movement that they were able to raise the money to pay the bail for all of the young people who had been arrested in Birmingham. That's Uncle Martin and Brando. That's them at Burt Lancaster's house. And then after that was the March on Washington. And we were demanding voting rights, the very same thing that we're demanding again all over the United States of America, simply because Senator Lindsey Graham, the day of the insurrection, January 6th, as he stood before members of the Senate, and he said, "You all are wrong if you think that Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Justice Roberts is the way that we need to do this. There's another way that we can do this." And he began his talk by saying, "Oh, and I love Tim Scott, the Black legislator from their state." But he wanted to do the same way and do the end around the way they had done under Reconstruction, to take away voting rights so that they would deal with it via each individual state and challenge. And that's what they did, following the guidance of Lindsey Graham, a Southerner who knew the laws and knew the history and knew how they had undone the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And that's why I always say that the people that do not know their past are destined to repeat it. And that's where we are today. I don't know how much further I can go, because I think we've been on this now an hour and 40 minutes. And I think that's longer. So I'm sure you all have questions, but I'll just show you pictures really quickly. And it says, "We marched together, Catholics and Jews and Protestants." We were black and white together. That's what I loved. We used to sing with "We Shall Overcome," black and white together. And we would join our hands, and "We are not afraid, and God is on our side," as we sang "We Shall Overcome." And these are again, the movie stars. And I was there that day. Charlton Heston, Sidney Poitier, who died the other day, who gave so much and never, ever, ever, wanted any publicity for what he did, with Harry Belafonte, who's still alive. And Charlton Heston had a conversation with me before he died, and he wanted me to understand and to let people know that he stood for people's right to, for Black people's rights and for civil rights. And that even though he was now becoming the poster boy for gun control and for white supremacists, he did not believe that. And he wanted me to understand, because he requested that I telephone him, that we have this conversation, because he wanted to set the record straight. And there you see him. And that's Paul Newman and Marlon Brando. And that's Charlton Heston reading a statement to the media, with James Baldwin beside him, Frank Silvera, and a movie star, Burt Lancaster behind him, and Brando, Sammy Davis, Harry and Sidney, and other people from the entertainment industry. And Heston is reading the statement about his beliefs. And he's not addressing the paper, he's addressing the media for what he believes is right. And here Uncle Martin is walking out, getting ready to deliver the speech. That's my dad speaking that day. I was there that day, but I don't remember my dad speaking this day. I just have the photograph of him speaking. And I do remember when Uncle Martin spoke. That's Uncle Martin there. And my mother is there next to Mahalia Jackson, behind Mahalia Jackson, and next to Aunt Coretta. as Uncle Martin delivers that speech, and he extends his arm to the people to let them know, let freedom ring. And there were, they say 200,000. Daddy said it was more like 350,000 people that were there. I just knew that there were people of all different colors, shapes, and sizes, and I'd never seen anything so magnificent as the sight of all of those people in Washington, D.C., the March on Washington. And in response, the people in Birmingham decided to bomb 16th Street Baptist Church because they were white supremacists and they did not believe that what was happening was good. And so they wanted to send a message, and that's what they did in Birmingham. They bombed. And it was Children's Day. It was the first time ever children were going to take over the church. And they placed the bomb. They had tried to place the bomb the week before, right after the March on Washington. But Mr. Lay, the civil defense worker, saw them and yelled to them, and they ran away from the church. Reverend Cross told me this. That's how I know this. And so the following weekend, and they always wanted it to be when the church was loaded with people, that following a week later, on a Saturday in the wee hours of the morning, they placed that bomb there. And they waited in their car across the street that following morning and waited. And the girls were in, the children had Sunday school downstairs, and the girls were in the bathroom, and the adults had Sunday school upstairs in the sanctuary. And the girls were, there were 5 girls in that bathroom. 4 of them were killed, 1 survived. These are the girls. That's Cynthia Wesley in the upper left. And next to her is Carol Robertson. Cynthia was 14, Carol was 14. Carol's family lives across the street from my parents' home, her cousins. And the bottom right is 11-year-old Denise McNair. And then all the way on the lower left is Addie Mae Collins, who was 14 years old. Denise was 11. But Addie Mae's parents were so poor, they couldn't afford to pay for a school day picture for Addie Mae, so that's the only picture they have of her. But Addie Mae's sister, Sarah, is this one here. The glass, a whole huge chunk of glass flew into her eye, and that eye had to be removed. She has shards of glass in her other eye, and her forehead is full of glass. And to this day, her forehead is still bumpy because of the glass. Sarah was 12 years of age, and they were just being little girls in the bathroom because it was the first annual Children's Day ever at the church. Here you see them taking bodies out. And I'm not going to tell you all the details of it. It was just an horrific thing. And I'll never forget that. That was my earliest knowledge or understanding of death. It was the death of children, of little girls. This is a man praying across the street because of the sight of what they saw as the bodies were being taken out. And the police were there with their guns. And I mean, the pictures speak for themselves. This is the funeral. Daddy and Uncle Martin and Shuttlesworth have come to perform the last rites over the girls. And you can see it's standing room only in the church, 6th Avenue Baptist Church, as Uncle Martin delivers the eulogy for the girls. At this point, it's actually only 3 girls because Carol Robertson's, whose family lives across the street from my parents, they were very well-to-do, and they wanted a private and separate funeral for their daughter. So they had her funeral the day before. But on this particular day, the funeral for Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley was held. And here you see them, the family leaving as the caskets are being taken to the church. And that's Denise McNair's casket. That's her father holding on to her mother. Her mother died about a month and a half ago. So now everybody is basically leaving. So I'm one of the few that remain who can actually tell you the story of these people and put names to the faces. This is Reverend Cross. He's holding the Bible as my dad is standing there to the right as they get ready to put Cynthia Wesley's body into the ground. Cynthia Wesley's parents were so poor when she was growing up that her mother gave her to the Wesley family. Mrs. Wesley, whose name was Dear, and her husband, who was principal of the Negro High School, they couldn't have any children, and they raised Cynthia as their own. So she had a wonderful life. She got a chance to go to Washington and do everything she wanted to do, and Dear would buy anything that she wanted. Dear told me this herself, because Cynthia meant so much to her because she was unable to have children. But here they are giving the last rites. And then right after that, they made good on the promise of the hate mail that they used to send to my parents. They said the Kennedys were going to find it'll be a new era for them in 1964, and they promised to harm them. And sure enough, they killed President John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. That is Mrs. Kennedy and her children as they descend the steps from viewing his body or from the service itself. And that was 1963, and so this is 64. Uncle Martin gets the Nobel Prize. I'm just going to show you the pictures. That's after the Nobel Prize. That's the committee after the Nobel Prize. And my mother would have an attack of angina that day, which would trouble her heart, which is how she would ultimately die in 2019. Her heart was damaged in 64, and then she died in 2019, but she lived a long life. After that, Daddy and Uncle Martin toured Europe, and that's them in Berlin on the west side of the Berlin Wall. And then they went to Italy. And after that, they went down to St. Augustine, because we who live in California get a chance to enjoy the United States, enjoy the ocean. But back then you couldn't enjoy the ocean. There was a little Negro section in Santa Monica, which was where Black people could go to the beach. And down there in Manhattan Beach, there was another little section where Black people could enjoy the beach, but they didn't want Black people down there. And so they bought up the land and said it was for public domain, and took the land and blocked people from the beach down there in Manhattan Beach. And thankfully, they just returned the land to the family that owned this land down there by the ocean. But there's still that same level of segregation, because I always say to my husband, I'm very uncomfortable to go to Manhattan Beach because of the looks and the stares that I receive that make me feel unwelcomed. And it shouldn't be that way. But this is Florida, and we wanted to go to the ocean. Uncle Martin was gone by the time I finally got a chance to go to the Atlantic Ocean and to put my feet in the sand and to feel sand and to feel the undertow. I didn't know anything about it, but it was a novelty to me, and it was great, and it was tremendous. And man can't control that ocean. Man shouldn't have the right to decide who gets to enjoy it. Man can't even stop it from rising as it rises every single day. So I don't know who man thinks he is, or why white men think that they have the rights to govern when they don't. Nature, the force of nature, is far greater than the will of man. Here they are in Florida, down there in St. Augustine. The man who owns the Munson Hotel decides that he doesn't want Black and white people swimming in the pool, so he's pouring acid into the pool because these Black people are in the pool with these white people. And then right after that, in 64, they killed the 3 civil rights workers who had gone down to Neshoba County, Mississippi. White students, Gwen, who just died the other day, she ran the SCOPE program. And in the SCOPE program, white students in 64 converged on the South, and they stopped in Atlanta, where they learned about nonviolence and what to do and how to register people to vote. And then they went from there to further deep in the deep South. And Andrew Goodman was trained in Ohio. Michael Swerner was the first person down there. James Chaney was his friend. And they went and they picked up Andrew Goodman. And Andrew Goodman had just arrived that day. And they went down there to Neshoba County to see that the church that had been burned, where they had been meeting people trying to register them to vote. And as they left the church and reassured the people everything was going to be okay, the police arrested them and accused them of speeding, which they were not. They kept them in jail until dark. Sue Brown, this young woman whose role I played in a movie, kept calling them repeatedly, trying to make sure everything was okay. And Michael assured her everything was okay and that they were going to leave and they would be driving back. But instead that night, as they left, they were chased down the highway by the Ku Klux Klan and taken off into a side road. They took them out of the car and they hunted them like animals and shot and killed them, and shot James Chaney first and buried them in an earthen dam. And it didn't go down at all like they said in that movie, Mississippi Burning. There was a Klansman of social conscience who was there that night, who participated and was mortified by what he saw and what he participated in. And he was the one who finally told the FBI when they arrived. J. Edgar Hoover sent the FBI in droves down there. And he told the FBI what had happened. He was the informant. It wasn't a woman like Frances McDormand like they did in the movie. Anyway, while they're still missing Daddy and Uncle Martin in their sunglasses that are exactly alike, because they did everything exactly alike, and that Sunshine, the black man in the hat who worked for them, they are confronting the sheriff, Cecil Price, I believe that's his name, and other members of Ku Klux Klan about the whereabouts of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Swerner. And then right after that, they got a chance to meet Malcolm X. They only met one time. And then this is 65 and it's Selma, and that's John Lewis and Jose as their, Mrs. Amelia Boynton ran the Dallas County Voters League, and she during 63 invited Daddy and Uncle Martin to come down there to Selma. But Daddy and Uncle Martin didn't go right away. And then they appealed again. And so my dad went down there first, and Uncle Martin was really nervous. He said, listen, be really careful, because a rattlesnake was found in the mailbox of one of our supporters. So my dad went in, he preached, and he said, we're down there. We're coming down here. We're going to fight for the right to vote. And they were supposed to march on this particular Sunday morning, but my dad said to Uncle Martin, I can't march, but you can march this day. And Uncle Martin said, no, if you're not marching, I'm not marching. Let's call off the march. And so, but the word did not go out into the community because Daddy and Uncle Martin were in Atlanta, Georgia. And so what happened was Jose Williams called my dad from Brown Chapel. He said, all of these young people have shown up and they want to march. What can we do? And my dad said, let me call Martin, I'll see. So Daddy called Uncle Martin, and Uncle Martin said, I don't think we should let him march. And Daddy said, if we don't let Jose lead this march, he'll be angry with us for the rest of our lives. We have to let him march. And also simultaneously, John Lewis had just resigned from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee because the SNCC students had been there before SCLC had moved in, and SNCC didn't want to work with SCLC. And so John Lewis said, listen, I just want us to have the right to vote. I just want us to have freedom. And I will work with Martin Luther King and Ralph David Abernathy. If you won't, I sure will. I resign. And so he said, I will march. And he put on his little backpack and his raincoat, and he had his toothbrush, he said. And he crossed that bridge with Jose, and he marched on into history. And the rest of those people who are part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their names are not as well known as John Lewis, because John stood on principle. John stood for what was right. And there was Jose as they go across that bridge. And there they were trampled. They were met by angry policemen. Jim Clark, the police chief, had shoved people who were trying to register to vote, and they had tear gas, and some of them were on horseback, and they beat them unmercifully as they stood at the base of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And the photographs speak for themselves. And that's John Lewis on the ground right there. So Daddy and Uncle Martin and my mother went to the White House to meet with President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And that's my mother in the middle there. Behind them is Bernard, who's Uncle Martin's now, he's his executive assistant and traveling companion. And Bernard was the student from Alabama State that had been with my dad since day one. And then behind them is Fred Bennett, who was a member of Ebenezer, who worked for Uncle Martin. Next to Uncle Martin is the congressman from the District of Columbia. And the man in the white suit, I don't remember. And Lucy Baines Johnson sent this photograph to me after the movie Selma had come out. She said, because they're rewriting history and your father's not there, and I want you to have this picture because your father was there. And she at that point was running the Johnson Library. And she said, people need to know your father was there, and people need to know the way my father stood for civil rights and how we were working together. And not LBJ was not the bigot that he was depicted to be in that movie, or a horrible man like young people today think about him because of the Vietnam War that he didn't start. Anyway, that's them leaving because now they have a plan. President Johnson said, listen, I need you all to raise as much public awareness and public attention of what you all are doing in Selma, and I will take care of the members of the Senate and the Congress. And Lucy Baines told me that her father grabbed Senator Dick Dirksen by his suit collar. And LBJ was a tall man, and she said he lifted him up off of the ground, and she said to me, you will support this Voting Rights Act. And the senator said, yes, Mr. President, I will. And that's how the Voting Rights Act was passed. Anyway, that's them leaving the Oval Office, my mother and father and Uncle Martin. And then they had a press conference back down because they're back now in Selma. And they're taking a knee again in Selma because they were then raising awareness, and they had several marches. And of course, the police were angry. And that's my favorite photo of them, as Daddy prays. He was great at praying. This is another march they had in Montgomery. This same photograph was on the wall in Nancy Pelosi's office. And as the January 6th insurrection was happening, I'm watching this on the television, and I'm watching the man in Nancy Pelosi's office, and a voice just said, look to the left. And I turned to the left, and on the wall there beside her window was this particular photograph on a plaque. And I saw my dad and Uncle Martin, and all of a sudden the insurrection became personal to me. Became something that I decided that I was willing to die for and to fight for, because I would fight for our democracy. We had built this country, and that even now today, I must commit myself for that which is right and be the freedom fighter that my dad and Uncle Martin were, and John Lewis and Nancy Pelosi is, and Steny Hoyer, and now our President Biden and Kamala Harris, and all of the great people in Washington who are trying to protect our democracy and our rights as American citizens. Anyway, they continued. I'm just going to show, and it's black and white together. You see them marching for the right to vote. That's all it was about. And this is the second leg of that march. This was known as Turnaround Tuesday. And they were met by policemen who were ready to pulverize that group who'd come across. So my dad decided to pray, and Rabbi Dresner, who just died a month ago as well, prayed as well. He was the most arrested rabbi in the civil rights movement. And that was what was so incredible, was clergymen of all different faiths and all different religions. And Rabbi Dresner brought Rabbi Abraham Heschel to this movement. But Rabbi Dresner was always there. And this is a wreath, because when these ministers arrived and had to do turnaround Tuesday, Reverend James Reeb was in that group with 2 other ministers. And so they ate that night in a soul food restaurant, a Black restaurant in Selma. They're from Massachusetts, so they wanted to have some soul food, you know, cornbread and collard greens and probably pork chops, smothered pork chops, the things that Black Southerners would eat. And when they left the restaurant, the white supremacists saw these white men leaving that Black soul food restaurant, and they beat them unmercifully and killed Reverend James Reeb, this white minister from Massachusetts. And this is the wreath that Uncle Martin is carrying for Reverend James Reeb. And there they stand for Reverend Reeb. And that was on the courthouse steps. That's Daddy and Uncle Martin with their heads together at the service that they had for Reverend Reeb. And then LBJ sent in the National Guard, and that's the official start of the march. And that's Rabbi Abraham Heschel, Ralph Bunch, who had already won a Nobel Prize, Uncle Martin, my dad, a Catholic nun, and John Lewis, who was representing young people across America and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they're wearing leis because the Hawaiian delegation brought them leis, because of course Hawaii is a state, even though people tried to say that it wasn't in the previous presidential administration. And this is Jim Lethera, who marched with one leg. He was a war veteran, and he believed in what was right, and he marched with one leg 55 miles from Selma to Montgomery. Selma was the little town where my father met my mother and fell in love with her when she was a student, and she was writing him the little pen pal letters. Selma is the closest town, 25 miles, where you would shop for the little town where my mother grew up, which was Uniontown, and where my father grew up in Linden. So everything was about Alabama for my family. And yeah, and they're marching, and you can see the white faces among the Black faces. It wasn't us alone, it was Black and white together. And that's what they were afraid of, Black and white together, which is why they're trying to polarize us now and separate us. And here you see the clergymen and the nuns and the Black people, and we're all carrying American flags because we're all American citizens. And the right to carry an American flag was not something that only the Republicans had. And the other thing I need you all to understand, I don't know where the lie came from, but it's a malicious lie that Martin Luther King was a Republican. That is not true. I know very well for a fact he was a Democrat. And he was not a Republican, but somehow or another, there are malicious lies that are circulating today that Uncle Martin was a Republican. He wasn't. His niece may be a Republican, Alveda King Beale, but Uncle Martin was not a Republican. He did not vote for Richard Milhouse Nixon. He voted for John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He voted for Lyndon Baines Johnson. Anyway, here's Daddy and Uncle Martin along that 55 march walk from Selma to Montgomery, reading the paper. And that's me right there, that little girl in the striped sweater, because we marched 2 days. And it was 8 miles per day that we marched. So that was 16 miles I walked at the age of 7. My brother was 6. My sister was 10 as we marched for our right to vote. And my mother's hand is in my back because I walked too slowly. And so this priest comes and yanks my hand and pulls me on down the road because all of these people are behind us. And of course, I was slowing everybody down. And this is the photograph that is now famous and belongs in public domain of that day. And we're singing "We Shall Overcome." And then that night, the movie stars arrived, and the singers, and Uncle Martin is thanking the movie stars and the singers for their donations and for their service. And there's Harry Belafonte, and Uncle Retta's so nervous because she has to sing. She was a singer. She met Uncle Martin when she was at New England Conservatory of Music. And so she's nervous that night because she's going to be singing in a few minutes. But that's Bernard and Uncle Martin and Uncle Retta and Harry. I don't know those two men. And the little girls down there, that's me in the striped sweater with my hands, and I'm in front of my sister in the white sweater. And then the following morning, Uncle Martin was late. So we arrived to march. And I'm little girl, I'm sucking my thumb, and we're waiting for Uncle Martin, and Daddy is standing there with Mother talking to John Lewis. And the man next to him is Reverend Reese, who led the Dallas, who led the movement in Selma. And behind him is Shuttlesworth, who led the Birmingham movement. But Reverend Reese is nameless in history. And behind Reverend Reese is the white face of Jim Lethera, who walked all of those miles as a veteran. And then we began the march without Uncle Martin. And we walked the front lines. And then we got to the edge of St. Jude's so that everybody could then line up, and we wait for Uncle Martin. And it was raining, so that's why you see the little plastic accordion rain cap on my head and on my sister's head. I'm standing in front of my mother. And then this is the official photograph of the march. And my brother's up ahead, above Uncle Martin's head, riding, because he's 6 and it's too far for him to walk. And that's Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, who had organized the March on Washington. James Foreman behind them, John Lewis, Uncle Retta, Uncle Martin, Daddy, and I don't know that man, but I was standing backstage at that point. And there was Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Harry Belafonte, and Joan Baez, James Baldwin. My brother trying to convince my dad to do something, I'm not quite sure. And that's Daddy and Uncle Martin together. My dad was the MC that day, and Uncle Martin delivered the sermon that day. So then finally, my dad just made my brother sit down between his legs as Uncle Martin got ready to deliver his speech. And my sister and I are backstage as Uncle Martin delivers that prolific, powerful, powerful sermon. And then at the end of everything that day, Mrs. Vaula Lauza, this white housewife that you see right here in front of us, had these 4 young men that she had marched with. She was driving them back to Selma, and she dropped everybody off except for the person that's all the way to the left, Leroy Moulton, who was in the front seat of her car. When the Ku Klux Klan saw, or the white supremacists saw, this white woman with blonde hair with this young Black 19-year-old boy in the front seat, or a young man in the front seat of her car. And they shot and killed her. And they thought they had shot and killed him. With her brains splattered all over him, he passed out. So when they checked to make sure that everybody in the car was dead, and they proceeded to try and shoot up the car, the FBI informant said, "Stop, don't shoot everybody up. People will come. Can't you see they're dead? They're all dead in here. Let's go." And they got in their car and they drove on down the road. And eventually Leroy Moulton said he awakened covered in blood and brains, and he walked in the shadow all the way back to Selma. And he called Jose Williams. And then Jose said, "Okay, I'll meet you at the police station, and you turn yourself in and you tell them exactly what happened." And he did, and they arrested him. But thankfully, the FBI informant who was in the car told the truth, and he said, "We did it. He didn't have anything to do with it. He was a victim. We thought he was dead too. We thought we had killed him too." And then right after that, they signed the Voting Rights Act into law, President Johnson. And that's Daddy and Uncle Martin standing beside each other, waiting. Lucy is behind her father. She said that her father made her come to work with him that day. He said, I'm signing the most important legislation of my career, and I want you to be there with me today because it's very important, and you to be a witness, to I honor, as he honored the Constitution and honored democracy for all Americans. And there they're shaking hands and giving the ink pen to Uncle Martin. And actually he gave an ink pen to my dad as well. And then right after that, we integrated the schools. So I'm just showing you pictures because I think it's running over, and this is Memphis. And there was a riot at that march in Memphis. And afterwards they had a press conference, Daddy and Uncle Martin, as they sit together and assume blame for what happened at that march. But there were rebel rousers who had been paid, and they said that they were paid by white men to create a riot, which they did. But Uncle Martin never spoke about it. Instead, he and Daddy assumed responsibility for it. They had changed their hotel room from the first floor to the second floor, and Uncle Martin was troubled. He's like, why is our hotel room on the second floor? Why did they move our bags? And Daddy's like, it's up there. We got to go up there. And Jesse Jackson had changed the room. And I don't know why. Daddy never knew why. He was pretty upset. So they go up the steps and they go to the room. And there's Jesse, really happy they're up there and everything, and Jose. And I guess Uncle Martin is still troubled. He doesn't understand why. And when they flew in, there was a bomb threat on the plane. And Uncle Martin turned to my dad. He said, why do they have to taunt me like this? Why do they have to treat me like this? Anyway, this is that night. And the night of the speech, Uncle Martin didn't want to speak. Jesse wanted to speak. And Uncle Martin said, I'm not going to go. Ralph, you go. And Daddy went. He arrived at the Mason Temple, and all the people applauded. And Daddy realized they weren't applauding for him. They were applauding thinking that Martin was there. But he wasn't. It was Daddy. But he still received this standing ovation. And my dad said, no, I got to get to a phone. And he got on the phone. He called Uncle Martin. He said, I need you to come. Promise me you're going to come. Don't trick me. Promise me you're going to come. Uncle Martin said, I promise I'll be there. So he arrived. But you can see that faraway gaze in his eyes because they had told him they were going to kill him. And I don't know why this particular day it was more pressing than before, but he knew. That's all I can say, and you can see it in his eyes. And Mrs. Wade from our church had told Uncle Martin and my dad that Uncle Martin should not go to Memphis because she believed that they were going to kill him. And I remember this before he went. He spoke that night. My dad spoke first and introduced Uncle Martin. And he said, when Uncle Martin got up to the microphone, he said, I didn't know who Ralph was talking about. He said, every now and then it's really good to have your best friend say wonderful things about you. And he said that Ralph Abernathy is the best friend that I have in the world. And then he went on and talked about the difficult days ahead that we were going to encounter. And then he said, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people shall make it to the promised land. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Uncle Martin had grown into the man that he was meant to be. At the close of his speech, you see he walks just to my dad's arms and just basically collapse. And so the following morning or afternoon, they were supposed to have dinner at Reverend and Mrs. Billy Kyle's house. They called Mrs. Kyle to see what they were going to have for dinner. Uncle Martin was anxious. He wanted to know. They were hungry. Daddy was putting on his Aramis cologne. Uncle Martin was standing out on the balcony, and he was apologizing to Jesse for not letting him speak. And he said, I'm inviting you to dinner, Jesse, you can come. Somebody said, Dr. King, it's cool. You need a jacket tonight. Bring a coat. And then Daddy said he heard something that sounded like a firecracker as he was putting on his cologne, because he had just, that's all he did was go back into the room to put on his cologne for a second. And in that second of time, or 2 seconds, when my dad stepped back into the room, that's when that bullet rang out. And Daddy said he heard what sounded like a firecracker. And when he looked, all he could see was Uncle Martin's feet. And he got to Uncle Martin, and everybody scattered. Everybody ran, and it was just Daddy and Uncle Martin there on that balcony. And Daddy said he looked at Uncle Martin and patted on the other cheek, because the bullet went into this cheek. And he said, "Martin, this is Ralph. Martin, this is Ralph." And Uncle Martin's eyes were wobbly, and then all of a sudden they focused intently on Daddy. And Uncle Martin tried to move his lips, but no words came out. He was trying to say something, but he couldn't. And then somebody got a cloth and they covered that part of his face, because the cheek had been blown away, and it just opened up. And I'll just show you the pictures. That's Daddy trying to step over Uncle Martin to take care of him. And then he's showing the police officer where the bullet has entered Uncle Martin's face. Finally, the ambulance arrives, and Daddy is there with Bernard. They are the only people that go in the ambulance with Uncle Martin to the hospital. And when he's there, they said to my dad in the trauma bay, in the emergency room, that there wasn't anything they could do. And they said, if you want to have these final moments with him, you can. What they had done is they cut Uncle Martin's clothes open, and there was this big hole in the chest because the bullet had exploded out of Uncle Martin's chest. And I guess it had missed his heart. But they said he was definitely going to die. And if he lived, he would be a vegetable, because the bullet had severed the spinal cord. And Daddy went over to Uncle Martin, and he took him up in his arms, and he cradled him as his breathing became less and less. And a few minutes later, he died in my dad's arms. And that was it. That night, that's Daddy, patting his cheek the way he did on the balcony, on the ground of the balcony. And behind him in the glasses is Uncle Martin's brother, Uncle A.D. But everybody deferred to my dad, even Uncle Retta. She said, whatever you want, it's what you decide about his body, if he has an autopsy or what, because Martin would want you to decide. So my dad made the decision. He thought it was right to do the autopsy, but when he arrived that night for the autopsy, he said they were carving his insides out, and they didn't want him to be in there, but my dad said he had to be in there, and he was horrified by what he saw, which is why when they decided they wanted to do the autopsy on my father, I said, no, my mother gave me the right, the decision to make the decision, since I was the only one that was there with my father when he died. And I said, no autopsy. We know why he's died. He suffered the blood clot. So don't carve him up. Because my dad regretted that he let them perform an autopsy on Uncle Martin. And so the following day, we finally got the legal right to have the march in Memphis. That's me right there, that little girl in the front with my sister holding her hands. That's Dexter, that's Martin, that's Rosa behind, and Daddy and Uncle Retta. And that's the march in Memphis. And that's us saying goodbye to Uncle Martin officially. my brother, and Uncle Martin's secretary, Dora, Uncle Retta, Dexter, Martin, Uncle Bob Williams, who had been Uncle Retta's friend for many years, Bernice, and Yolanda, and the babysitter beside her. That's Uncle Martin's funeral program. This is Uncle Martin's funeral as my dad, conducted the funeral. These are all the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that stood outside the church for Uncle Martin's funeral. And Daddy decided that Uncle Martin would be carried in a wagon, representative of the poor people that he served as they followed. And that's Uncle AD in the middle there, walking behind his brother's body. That's Mahalia Jackson at the funeral, trying to get into the church. She sang Precious Lord, Take My Hand, Uncle Martin's favorite hymn. That's Mrs. Kennedy, who came that day to be with us. She was there at the house that morning before the funeral, and I ran to her side to stand beside her. These are the actors, the movie stars. Lillian Lewis, John Lewis's wife, walking beside Tony Franciosa in front of James Baldwin, and behind him is Sammy Davis Jr., whom we knew as Uncle Sammy, who brought us to Hollywood in 1964 when Sidney Poitier won the Nobel Prize and won the Academy Award. There's Dick Gregory. This is George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, who was a very liberal man who stood for our cause, for the cause of Black people, so that everybody would know that we deserved freedom, justice, and equality like everybody else. It's Uncle Retta and Bernice and Bernard. Uncle Retta, behind her is Yolanda, their oldest daughter. That's Martin, who's my age. And then that's them marching for the first time. The only time Uncle Retta allowed them to march as children was in their father's funeral march. And that's them, the casket, and all the men who worked for Daddy and Uncle Martin surrounding the casket. And then we got out of the limousine to get ready to bury him. That's my sister getting out of the car. Uncle Retta wanted us to wear white. I'm the little girl at the bottom of the screen. On the left, that's Harry Belafonte, his wife, Julie. Aunt Edith, I don't know the heavyset lady. The lady with the hat behind is my mother. That's my brother, Ralph III. And that's the back of my head with the white bow and the earrings as we stand with Harry and Aunt Edith trying to figure out where we're going to go sit. That's me again, that little girl with my sister and Harry Belafonte and my brother beside us. And then there's Big Mama and Granddaddy as they enter to take their seats and as they set up where the casket would go because we were going to put him in the wall. And that's Daddy leading the procession with Benjamin Mays, president of the college, Morehouse College, where Uncle Martin had gone, where Daddy met him. And those are the men, the staff, who carried his body. Right there in the white shirt with open collars, JT Johnson, who just called me right before I got on this call just to check in to make sure I was okay today. He's the only one still alive. That's Daddy and Granddaddy talking. Big Mama crying. Yoki and her cousin Darlene and Bernice on her lap and Martin beside her. Uncle Retta. Beside Uncle Retta is her father. That's my dad doing the last rites for Uncle Martin. He said, and so I commit your body earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and that was it. And that's Uncle Martin. And here's my dad with Congressman John Conyers asking and appealing for the observation of the holiday that we now celebrate today. And that was the story of how we gained civil rights in the United States of America. And I'm the daughter. I'm the goddaughter of Uncle Martin, and I'm the daughter of my father. And America is a great country today because they lived and because they had the courage to stand up and to fight. And that's it. If you have questions, those of you who are still here or not, Christine, please take over.
Thank you so much, Donzaleigh, for such a fabulous program. Very heartfelt, very warm, very hard program to watch about the history of our country. Something very special to show Black History Month. So we thank you very much for sharing your family legacy with us today, very, very much. I know everyone has enjoyed it very much. Everybody's a very emotional force. It's just a beautiful telling of this very important story. It will be on YouTube Pasadena Library for you to share with your family and friends. And so I know you will want to rewatch it, go over this very historic information. Also, I want to encourage you to get a copy of the book, Partners to History by Donzaleigh. Let me pick it up for you, show you. This is the book, Partners to History.
Yeah.
It is available at the Pasadena Public Library. We have 2 copies for you to check out and study and review all of this very, very important information. And we thank you so much, Donzaleigh, for your time and effort for the Pasadena Public Library to share this important information for us. Is there any questions in chat? I see one question in chat. I know everybody's thanking you very much. Everyone is saying such a beautiful telling of this story. It certainly does matter to our country and to the future. And we can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Thank you so much.
I apologize again for the technical difficulties, but thank you just for being here with us and honoring our history. And it's this is what people call critical race theory, but in fact, it's just the history, the truth of how we came to be and why we try to fight and why we want to be equal and loved and live together as brothers and sisters in peace.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for your time to share this with us this afternoon as part of Pasadena Public Library's Black History Month celebration. Very, very important. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Encourage you to check out the book and re-look at the program on YouTube Pasadena Library. Thank you so much, Donzaleigh, for sharing it with us today.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
God
Thank
bless
you.
you.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Okay.